In fact, for many people, this is the root of their imposter syndrome, and once they do implement this step, their imposter syndrome is all but eradicated. Are you ready to know what it is? Hello and welcome back to my channel where I help you slay your career and cultivate the successful life you deserve. For the best career success advice that you'll find on the internet, make sure and click the subscription button and the notification bell right now. That's gonna get you 2 videos a week. Do you ever feel like a fraud at work? If you're a high achiever, like most of my clients, and if you're not a high achiever, I'm not even sure how you found this channel, to be quite honest with you. You probably experience something called imposter syndrome from time to time, or all the time in some cases. And I find this to be especially true when you have experienced a toxic workplace or a bad boss who has unfairly criticized your work, your talents, and your ability. So today I'm going to help you overcome imposter syndrome at work. If that is something that you are absolutely here for, tap that like button and let's jump into it. Our first step to overcoming imposter syndrome is to actually name it. This means that we need to identify that what we are experiencing is in fact imposter syndrome. So it's going to take a little bit of self-awareness here. And I know that this sounds simple, but just simply identifying what you are experiencing is going to be tremendously helpful. By naming imposter syndrome for what it is, you are going to take yourself out of your irrational brain that is telling you that you aren't good, that you're not worthy, and it's going to bring you into your logical brain, which knows that you are extremely competent, if not exceptional, at what you actually do. But how do you know if it is imposter syndrome? Most people have the inner monologue. It's that little voice inside your head that's saying things to you. And imposter syndrome sounds a little bit like this. What are you saying? Oh, you suck so bad. You're terrible at what you do, and when people figure it out, you're going to lose your job. Does any of that sound familiar? What does that little inner monologue say to you? One thing I want to make sure that is crystal clear before we move into the next step in how to deal with imposter syndrome is just because it is your inner monologue and maybe it even sounds like your voice, it doesn't mean that it's true. And that actually brings us directly into the next step to overcome imposter syndrome at work, and that is to give yourself a reality check. Look, no one is perfect. Even if they make it seem like they're perfect, no one actually is. I know this is going to shock you, but even I'm not perfect. The truth is that everyone has self-doubt. Some people have it all the time, some people have some of the time, but it is something that no matter what does come up for people at work and in their lives. It's an old cliche to say that you are your harshest critic, but it's absolutely true. You don't have all the answers, and that makes you exactly like everyone else. And I think when you do this reality check, I want you to take an inventory and to really evaluate how good you actually are at what you do. Because for every thought of self-doubt and every time that imposter syndrome comes up, I bet you that you have a long list of evidence to the absolute contrary. However, I know when thoughts like this come up,
oh my goodness, I'm terrible at everything that I do and that I don't get fired is a daily miracle.
That being rational and aware of your awesomeness isn't always enough. So we need to dig in a little bit further to manage imposter syndrome at work. And this next thing that I'm going to tell you about, I'm actually shocked that it's not being discussed more frequently. I read countless blogs on this topic and I've only seen it come up maybe a couple of times. And if you don't know this one thing, it's going to be impossible for you to overcome imposter syndrome and stop feeling like a fraud at work. Your next step to obliterate imposter syndrome is to identify the triggers. Now, this really comes in one of 2 categories. The first is people. Sometimes there are people in our lives that really trigger imposter syndrome for us, especially if you work at a company with a high level of talent. Like if you're at one of the big tech firms that everybody is ridiculously credentialed, ridiculously smart, and ridiculously talented, imposter syndrome can come up a lot here, even when you're one of those super awesome people. Because let's face it, it's very challenging to be exceptional when you are around other exceptional people. people all the time. And it can make you feel like you're average or like you're not very good at all. On the flip side of that, sometimes there's people who will trigger our imposter syndrome because they're overly critical of us. This is where we think of people like the toxic manager or the jealous coworker who's trying to undermine you and ideas that you bring forward. We need to face the fact that some people are very malicious and that they are trying to corrode our confidence in ourselves, which I'm going to come back to in just a couple of minutes. And that is going to be what is actually triggering imposter syndrome at work for us. The next category of trigger is situational, and this is something that I also see very, very frequently with my clients. And that's where there are certain circumstances where they do feel like an imposter, and usually it's going to be something like speaking up in a meeting or giving a presentation. And it's generally going to be times that you're sitting in the hot seat where you might get a question that you don't know the answer to. And heaven forbid you actually get one of the questions that you don't know the answer to when you are in that circumstance to validate it all. Where you can start to identify these triggers, whether it's a person triggering your imposter syndrome or a situation that triggers your imposter syndrome, is to simply start observing it. Find where those feelings of self-doubt and feeling like you're a fraud actually do bubble up, and then start to find the consistency. You can also think back to times where you didn't feel confident, you felt like an imposter at work. The reason why knowing your triggers for your imposter syndrome is so crucial is that it's actually going to allow you to get ahead of it. Because if you are about to head into that meeting or interact with that person, then you know that these feelings are going to come up, and you can implement the remaining steps that we're going to cover in this video to help you overcome imposter syndrome. And that actually brings us directly into our next step, which is going to help immensely when it comes to imposter syndrome triggers and imposter syndrome in general. In fact, for many people, this is the root of their imposter syndrome, and once they do implement this step, their imposter syndrome is all but eradicated. Are you ready to know what it is? The next step to overcome imposter syndrome is to improve your confidence. I know this feels like a big one for a lot of you because confidence is something that so many people struggle with. One thing that I really want to make clear here is that confidence isn't something that you have or you don't have. Confidence is something that is going to fluctuate. It is going to be different in different areas of your life with different people in different circumstances. This is actually a generally complex thing. There are two main ways that people actually establish confidence. You can either get confidence externally, which means from other people and things like validation, or it can be internal, which is something that comes from inside of you. The more internal confidence that you establish, the more impervious you are to external factors which can negatively impact your confidence. Really, with confidence, what you want to focus on is raising your self-worth. That's the most important thing when it comes to imposter syndrome. The more confidence that you have and the higher your self-worth and your perceived value of yourself is, the less imposter syndrome is going to come up for you. Quite honestly, I can spend hours talking about building confidence. If you are interested in a video to help you boost your confidence in the face of imposter syndrome or just in general, let me know in the comments down below. Our next step to overcome imposter syndrome is basically the opposite of confidence. And it's something that can corrode your confidence really, really quickly because it's going to put you into fight or flight mode. So our next thing that we need to look at and we need to address to help us overcome imposter syndrome at work is fear. So let's back up a minute and evaluate this and explore how fear actually comes into play. When we look at the triggers and the thoughts that are happening when we're experiencing imposter syndrome, there is fear that is actually underlining that. There's a few different fears that are common in the triggers for imposter syndrome. The first one, and probably the most common that I personally see with my clients, is a fear of rejection. They're afraid people are going to laugh at them, and they're afraid they're going to be shunned by by their colleagues. Tied to this is a fear of failure. They're afraid of getting up there and saying something and having it be wrong, or pitching an idea and having it shut down. And sometimes I've even seen where it's things like fear of success that underlies imposter syndrome. So again, go back to those thoughts that you're having, go back to the doubts that imposter syndrome is raising, and I want you to really dig into it, because the more that you're understanding the why underneath the self-doubt, what are you actually afraid of, the more that you're going to be able to address it, and that is what is going to help you overcome imposter syndrome. And before we get all judgy about the fear that we have and how it raises imposter syndrome and how it doesn't serve us, I want us to talk about something that's actually very important and a crucial step for us to understand and overcome imposter syndrome, and that is understanding the actual purpose that imposter syndrome plays. Because fear is really underlying our imposter syndrome, we need to acknowledge that this is actually self-preservation. Our brain wants to keep us really, really safe, and it doesn't really understand that there is a range of severity in the danger that we may experience on a day-to-day basis at work. When we know this though, and we know that imposter syndrome is something that is normal, that it is a self-preservation tactic, that allows us to harness its power. Because remember, not all stress is bad stress. Some stress is incredibly productive. Same thing with fear. When you do feel imposter syndrome bubbling up, remember this is actually inner motivation for you to be your absolute best at work. And when you're able to capitalize it this way, instead of succumbing to the fear and holding yourself back at work, you are going to get yourself and your career onto a whole new level. And that brings me into the next step to dealing with imposter syndrome at work, and that is to not let it stop you. I believe it was Sarah Blakely who had this great quote about being scared and doing it anyway. Growth doesn't come from being comfortable. In fact, growth is really extremely uncomfortable in so many circumstances. Just because you have self-doubt, if there is fear that is rising up for you, and definitely when that is manifesting itself as imposter syndrome, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be pushing yourself, that you shouldn't be speaking in front of that group. Because when you're scared, when you have imposter syndrome and you do it anyways, more often than not, you are going to validate that you are much more talented, much more capable, and much more exceptional than you thought you were. And these are going to be things that ultimately help you overcome those fears, build more confidence, and obviously grow in your career. And that's why you're here, isn't it? When you do this and you are not afraid and you will not apologize for standing out at work, and that's where your career trajectory is just gonna go. If you feel like you have the tools that you need in order to manage your imposter syndrome and to take advantage of it, and you're really ready to start standing out at work, I want you to go and watch this video. As always, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, share it with a friend who's dealing with imposter syndrome, and don't forget, if you haven't already, to click that subscription button. As always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.